When I was a wee little yeti, I'd wake up early before school started to watch Animal Planet. And one of my favorite childhood heroes was the late Steve Irwin, a man who cared for wildlife and their habitats more than most anyone else I've seen. That is, until I met Erik Molvar of the Western Watersheds Project. Starting out as a ski bum and hiker while working in the food and beverage industry, Erik worked his way up to writing guidebooks and eventually becoming the executive director for the Western Watersheds Project. This Conservation Corner episode will be the first of a two-parter, covering my conversation with Erik on topics that range from the roadless rule, and a big middle finger to Mike Lee for that one, manifest destiny, dominionism, traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, kin-centrism, alongside his confident love and stance for the conservation of our wild spaces. I'm one of your hosts, Yeti Legs, and you're listening to the Yeti Walks into Base Camp Talking Through Hiking podcast, a show for hikers, backpackers, thru hikers, tree huggers, and anyone else who just loves to walk outside. We're a hiking podcast with a goal to make the outdoors more accessible for all of you by telling stories, sharing information, and having folks on the show that offer advice, gear, and peace of mind. We also like to talk about environmental topics like we are here in our Environmental Corner episode and what's happening on our planet. Knowledge is power, and as lovers of the great outdoors, we want all of us to feel a bit more empowered. A huge thanks to Skygoat and Leave Outdoors for sponsoring this episode. As a listener, you can listen through this episode to win either a free Alpha 90 hoodie from Leave Outdoors or some free hiking accessories from Skygoat. All right, let's hit the trail. All right, what's going on, Trail family, Tramley? We have an awesome guest here today. This is Erik Molvar. He is the executive officer with the Western Watersheds Project. And before we get into the interview here, I want to read a little bit about Erik's bio, and it's quite a doozy, y'all. All right, so Erik Molvar. I am the author of numerous hiking guidebooks, a backpacking techniques manual, and guidebooks to public lands, mostly for Falcon Publishing. I've hiked or backpacked over 10,000 miles in North American wildlands. I have conducted wilderness inventories covering more than 500,000 acres of public land in Wyoming. Boy, Erik, that's quite the resume you've got there. Thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Well, thanks for having me.
You've done a lot of hiking here, and the majority of our audience is definitely of the through hiking varietal. What's that 10,000 miles that you've done look like? And then we'll get into what you do exactly at the Western Watersheds Project.
Well, when I was in my 20s, I used to go out and take the summer and sometimes the fall and travel to a national park or a large wilderness area and hike all of the trails. And at the end of each day, I'd sit down and I had a little kind of blank journal, and I would just write down the trail description. And because I have a master's in wildlife biology, I knew a lot about the critters, the vegetation, and everything. So I would interpret that. And I'm kind of a history buff and a geology nut as well, so I'd throw that stuff in as well. And then at the end of the year, I would just basically type the contents of each one of these journals in and send it in and to Falcon Publishing, and out would come a book about a year and a half later. And so that's what I was doing for about 10 years. And the average book takes 1,000 to 1,500 miles of trail hiking. I would try to do long loops if I could, if there was a lot of backcountry. If not, I did a lot of day hiking and car camping.
And this is back in the day when you couldn't just self-publish a book on Amazon, right? You had to go through the actual process.
Oh, yes. I had to get this book called The Writer's Market. And it was a big tome about the size of what people may not even know what this looks like, but a telephone book. And it had the addresses and descriptions of all the publishers in North America. And so I picked out maybe a dozen publishers and then winnowed that down and picked my first 5 picks and sent off a cover letter and some sample chapters. And the first one that came back, this was a book to Glacier National Park, was my first book. And I wrote it while I was in grad school. And I had been a bartender at Lake McDonald Lodge for a couple of summers. And I had this killer schedule where I could do like an evening shift and then a morning shift. And then after my morning shift, I could take off and do an overnight backpack and then be back in the bar by 5 p.m. to start tending bar again. And so I would backpack on my work days. And then, of course, on my days off, I was backpacking. And towards the end of the season, in my second season, we were all sitting on the porch of the employee dorm and drinking and carrying on and complaining about how terrible the hiking guide was, because there was a hiking guide to Glacier National Park that was put out by the Glacier Natural History Association. And it covered trails that were 4 miles or less. And of course, Glacier National Park is one of the world's best backpacking parks. And so if you are only covering trails of 3 or 4 miles, that's kind of useless to backpackers. And while we're drinking and looking at the sunset, somebody looks at me and says, well, Erik, you've hiked all these trails. Why don't you write a book? And I thought, well, why not? And so I wrote that book and I sent it out. And the first press that got back to me was a press called the Appalachian Mountain Club out of the East Coast somewhere. And they wanted to go to contract. And so they called up the Glacier Natural History Association, because the Natural History Association controls all the book sales inside the park. And there was this fellow, I think his name is Clyde Lockwood, who was the head of the Natural History Association. He would tell the publishers, oh, well, the market's saturated. We don't need another hiking guide, because, of course, he was protecting his own book from competition. And so about the third company that came forward was Falcon Publishing. At that time, it was Falcon Press. It was a very small operation, an independent publisher out of Helena, Montana. And so they were locals. And when Clyde Lockwood said, yeah, the market's saturated, we don't need another hiking guide, the folks at Falcon said, oh, we've seen your bullshit hiking guide. We're going to write one anyway. Do you want a piece of the action or not? And of course he said, yes, of course I'll stock it in the park. And not too much later, my book came out. That was the end of the Natural History Association's, guidebook to the 3 and 4 mile hikes in the park. And then after I did that book, it was really the first hiking guide that Falcon did that was a comprehensive guide to all of the trails of a certain particular area, because Falcon at that time was doing books that were statewide, where they'd pick 1 or 2 trails in a particular mountain range, and then kind of have a book that was kind of a best of book. And mine was the first comprehensive guidebook to a national park. And since that one, when it came out, became one of the best-selling books on their lineup, they said, well, what other place would you like to go? And so I would basically kind of look at the map and say, well, I want to go to Zion and Bryce Canyon this year, or I want to go to the North Cascades, or I want to go to, the Colorado's Maroon Bell Snowmass Wilderness and do a book on that. And they would say, here's your contract, and off we'd go.
Boy. Did you do one for Maroon Bells and Snowmass?
I did. That was one of my last books.
Boy, that is such a stunning area, isn't it?
It's a beautiful place.
It is.
Lots of elk. And now they have wolves.
They do have wolves, which I hope we talk about in a few minutes. Anything with the word goat in it automatically grabs my attention, but I'm also kind of partial to watching those fainting goat videos on YouTube. I first came across Sky Goat, not up in the clouds, but here in Colorado at a sustainability conference, and immediately became hooked with the cozy yet lightweight gear that Ram, its founder, comes up with. Sky Goat creates technically functional, comfortable, and yet stylish apparel built for adventure, travel, and everyday life. Made with custom goat grid recycled fleece fabric and thoughtful design, the gear delivers lightweight warmth, breathability, and all-day comfort wherever the outdoors takes you. I wear my camp hoodie on a near daily basis when it's cold outside. It's cozy, sexy, and it keeps the cold edge off when hiking or when out in the field. Ram is giving away a free beanie, neck gaiter, or even a pair of gloves to one lucky listener. Go start following Sky Goat on Instagram, tag us at Yeti Walks into Base Camp, and 2 of your friends on your favorite Sky Goat post, and the first person to do that will be the lucky winner of their choice between a beanie, gaiter, or a pair of gloves. First come, first serve. We'll be sure to reach out to you when you do it. If you like the goat grid feel, you can hike on over to skygoatusa.com for your own hoodie, beanie, gloves, or even a poncho. Plug in the code YetiWalks20, that's YetiWalks20 to get 20% off of your entire purchase. Thanks, Ram, for sponsoring this episode and for believing in our show. So this is originally a through hiking podcast, and you're talking about all these trails that you've done. It sounds like you've blazed some of your own trails as well. Have you done any of the established long trails in North America?
I have not hiked any long through hikes, although, my North Cascades book has the comprehensive, all the trails in the North Cascades and down into the Glacier Peak wilderness. And I remember when I was doing that book, you know how through hikers often have nicknames and whatnot, and they become quirky over long periods of long trails. And I remember when I was down in the Glacier Peak, I met this fellow, and we started talking, and then, about 3 weeks later, I was up in the Canadian part of the Cascades, and I ran into the same guy again, and I said, "What are you doing way this far south? I thought you were going to Canada. What are you doing? You're way down south of the Glacier Peak." And he was kind of disoriented for a minute there. I had him going, and finally he figured out I was pulling his leg. But yeah, it was a fun time.
Boy, it sounds like it. It sounds like you need to write more books, honestly.
Well, I have a full-time job as trying to keep the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Forest Service in line, and to protect the public lands that we all like to go out and hike on. So that takes a lot of time. I really don't have any time to fight off, kind of a whole summer to go disappear into the wilderness.
How is that job handling for you?
Well, in this day and age, it's very, very challenging because this is an administration that is all about oil and gas and logging and mining and cattle grazing and conservation. They don't care about it. Not only do they not care about it, but they actively want to sweep aside any of the regulations that protect the public interest, that protect the public lands, protect the wildlife, that keep the backcountry nice for the people that want to go out and visit it. They want to turn over the public land to the private corporations and let them exploit it and beat it into dust and wring every last dollar that they can wring out of those lands and leave nothing but a drained husk. It's a trench warfare out there right now.
Boy, you're not wrong. I interviewed two folks from Protect Our Winters recently. Really awesome people. But one of the things that we kept talking about was in both interviews was that, the love for the outdoors is bipartisan. There's no party association there. Republicans love to go outside and hunt and fish, and Democrats love to go outside and hike, and whoever in between. We all just like to be outside and to disconnect from the day to day. Like it's our time to recenter ourselves. So it's really frustrating to see this. And working with this on a daily basis, I'm sure you're far more frustrated than even I am.
Well, I've seen it before. I was executive director of Western Watersheds Project all the way through the first Trump administration. And all of the major things that they did to attack the environment, the striking down of Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, the striking down of the sage grouse conservation plans that were west-wide, all of the big Trump initiatives. Western Watersheds Project was right there at the forefront, fighting every single one. And at the end of the first Trump administration, when we got done with them in the courts, there was not one single major initiative that hadn't been reversed. So I have a lot of hope that we can beat back all of these different attacks because there's so much corruption. There's so much ignoring the science. There's so much ignoring the law in this administration, just like the first Trump administration. It makes it easy to pick apart in a courtroom. And that means that all of these major overreaches where you're out to destroy the public lands or turn them over or even sell them off, they can be reversed in court.
Yeah, I know. You're saying this. It's making me think about basically, I guess the retention of the roadless rule and how frustrating that one is for me because we only have so much, unfragmented habitat out there. And even if it doesn't have a road, there's typically a trail in some of these areas. So it's still kind of fragmented. But that's one that really hits home for me. And it's just super frustrating to know that is a real possible future for us.
Well, I think there's no doubt that they're going to try and get rid of the roadless rule.
Yeah.
I think that that too is going to be, they're going to take shortcuts. They're going to ignore the laws that are there to provide public process and public comment, I'm sure. And there are going to be groups that are out there that are going to challenge that decision in court as well. And I don't expect it to stand up. And right now, we're hearing a lot about this conservation rule that the Biden administration put in place. And it's a conservation rule that was it was billed as if it finally, for the first time, made conservation an equal multiple use with all the mining and drilling and livestock grazing. But the fact of the matter is that the Federal Lands Planning and Management Act in 1976 already, by federal law, made conservation an equal use, and fish and wildlife, watersheds, public recreation, those conservation values were written into that law, the same as mining and livestock grazing as co-equal multiple uses. So really the conservation rule, it did a little bit along the margins here and there to make things better. It did a little bit along the margins to make things a little worse. But in the end, it was kind of a wash. And so when it got gutted, people made a big deal about it, but it was really politics more than anything else. But the roadless rule is real.
Yeah.
The roadless rule prevents large-scale wild areas that are out there unprotected by federal statute to be kept roadless, kept wild, to maintain those habitats for species like elk that need large unroaded areas, to have high-quality trout fishing, to have high-quality backpacking and hiking. And these are the areas that oftentimes are the best areas for backcountry recreation. Because in the wilderness areas, once you draw a line on the map, and that shows up on the map and it becomes a destination, it becomes famous, and everybody starts talking about it, then pretty soon those wilderness areas get heavily crowded on the trails. It gets hard to find that solitude, which is supposed to be one of the hallmarks of wilderness. And so, those roadless areas that don't have that same formal designation and don't have that same public notoriety those are the areas where you can really find wildness and a sort of primeval experience. Because, one of the things that is most important about getting out into nature is escaping from all the distractions of day-to-day life. And when you're out in the middle of the wilderness, you are stripped down. Your cell phone doesn't have any coverage. You don't have anybody to help you. It's you, it's nature, it's what you've brought with you and the skills that you've learned and you're bringing to the experience. That's what you have to have your experience in the wilderness. And it really does simplify things for you from a philosophical standpoint. I always found that when I was deep in the wilderness, that all of the problems that seemed so insurmountable and seemed so frustrating when I was back home just fell away. And I realized how insignificant they were and how insignificant I was and how much bigger the world was than I was. And that's something that increasingly is more and more difficult to get as an experience because we are so plugged into the entire universe through the internet and now artificial intelligence. And it's overwhelming. And it fundamentally, it makes you forget what it's like to be a human being, a small dust speck of protoplasm out in the middle of a planet at the far end of a galaxy in an enormous universe. That's something that wilderness can teach you.
It really is. It's holistic immersion is what it is. And we know a lot of people who go out there to just hike for the sake of hiking. And you every once in a while you get that influencer who wants to go outside and, hike these trails to blog it. But for the most part, people are just out there to do exactly what you just said, to get outside, to be stripped down and to experience. Because to be honest, I think the times that I guess all the worries in my life have seemed so trivial is when I'm outside doing a hike for multiple days. And even more so whenever I'm in a pretty sketchy, treacherous, or dangerous situation, when the only thing that is on my mind is trying to get out of that situation, everything else just fades into the gray,
That's really true. You really become present
You do.
when you are faced with your own possibility that there's something out there that's bigger than you. That, I've been face to face with coastal brown bears in Alaska or grizzly bears in the northern Rockies. I've been in between a pack of wolves and its pups. These are kinds of experiences that sometimes dangerous. In the case of wolves, not dangerous at all, but certainly very thrilling and enervating, and it really does access a part of the brain that evolved over the course of more than 100,000 years of living with nature and being of nature. And that part of the brain doesn't really light up in your day-to-day job or your day-to-day experience. But boy, howdy, if you get in a situation where you're fording a river and all of a sudden it's a little bit deeper than you thought it was going to be, and the current is a little bit stronger than maybe you can quite handle, those neurons start firing and that survival instinct kicks in. And you're accessing a part of being human that people that stay in their chairs and in their day jobs just don't get to experience.
And there's a reason that people love to hear about animals encounters and near-death experiences, especially when out in the backcountry. That's a part of, that's something that most folks don't get immersed into. Even though it's hot outside, the nights can still be a little bit cool, or in some places, even freezing. To cut weight in my pack, I've started carrying clothing that I can wear during the day and in the sleeping bag for warmth while reducing extra ounces. For me, Leave Outdoors hits that sweet spot. With Alpha Direct tops, beanies, and pants, I cozy up in my sleeping bag with my back hurting a tad bit less at the end of every day. Cameron, the founder of Leave Outdoors, offers Alpha 60, 90, and 120 hoodies with different weights and therefore different warmth. But they're all only a handful of ounces. The bigger that Alpha number, by the way, the warmer the layer. He also sews a waterproof jacket weighing around 4 ounces. Let me let that sink in for a second. I know your jaw just dropped a little bit, didn't it? 4 ounces for a rain jacket. Use the code YetiWalks into Basecamp. That's the name of our podcast at leaveoutdoorco.com for 10% off Alpha hoodies, sun shirts, and even some new DCF dry bags he's made. But if you don't believe my testimony, then you can try out a free Alpha 90 hoodie for yourself. Tag us at YetiWalks into Basecamp and 2 of your friends on your favorite Leave Outdoors Instagram post. The first one to tag us gets the swag. Thanks, Cameron, for sponsoring the show and for keeping the load on all of our backs a tad bit lighter. I also want to talk about some of the stuff that you do at the Western Watersheds Project, because it sounds like these are your focuses right here. Impacts of livestock grazing, land health, wildlife conservation, and endangered species protections, including, and more specifically, the wolf recovery issue that's going on right now. So kind of to piggyback off of what we just talked about, why are these things that you do at the Western Watersheds Project, or WWP, I'll just start saying that. Why are the things that you do at WWP, why are they so heartfelt from you? And why do you think that people who love to hike and backpack and even just go outside, why do you think that they should be concerned and knowledgeable about these things that you do at WWP?
Well, the public lands that are out there, whether they're managed by the Bureau of Land Management or the national parks, they're managed by the National Park Service, or the National Wildlife Refuges by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, or the National Forests by the U.S. Forest Service, all of them have other users besides just the general recreating public. They have users who want to log the forest. They have users who want to, if there's a blade of grass that can be grazed commercially and profitably out there, there's a livestock producer that wants that blade of grass. If there's, a deposit of minerals that's profitable, whether that's hard rock minerals or whether it's oil and gas deposits, there are mining companies and oil and gas companies that want to get after it. And all of these agencies, even the Park Service, often authorize these commercial extractive uses on the public lands, even when those lands are primarily designated for wildlife conservation or for public recreation or for wilderness. There is livestock grazing commercially in wilderness. When I was doing my book, Wild Wyoming, I went to the Wind River Range and I went up to a place called Raid Lake, which is up in the Bridger Wilderness. And that place was so overgrazed. And I went to talk to the local Forest Service person who managed that wilderness. And that forest ranger said to me, "Oh yeah, we call the Raid Lake area the sheep desert because we lease that out for sheep grazing, and the sheep go up there into those fragile alpine meadows and they just mow it down to bare dirt." And that's what happened. And then years later, when I was with Western Watersheds Project, our settlement fund, which is a somewhat separate organization called the Sagebrush Habitat Conservation Fund, bought out the allotment, the Raid Lake allotment up there. And so now there are no more sheep in those alpine meadows in the Bridger Wilderness. But if you're a wilderness visitor, you would think, commercial sheep grazing, that's industrial, that's commercial, that's not wilderness. But when the Wilderness Act in the 1960s was being put together by Congress, one of the compromises that got made was if there is livestock grazing in the wilderness now, we're going to let that go ahead and continue. And that got baked in. And then in subsequent wilderness bills, often that same loophole is attached to new wilderness as well.
To explain things to folks who may not know, would you mind differentiating between the Department of Agriculture and Department of the Interior and like the big entities that they govern and really what they do?
Well, basically, they are very similar federal bureaucracies, but they're in completely different departments. And the U.S. Department of Agriculture is really more for farming and crop production, but the Forest Service got stuck into the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And, the Forest Service does treat the national forests as if they're primarily for logging. And timber is the commodity they produce. And recreation, well, it's secondary. And it's all about how many million board feet you can produce off your national forest. And that's how your job is graded if you're a forest ranger. If your district is producing a lot of timber, you're successful. If you're not producing a lot of timber, they're going to move you on to somewhere else. And then in the Department of Interior, they got the Bureau of Land Management, which were the kind of undesignated lands that were left over after all of the lands that the farmers wanted to homestead had been taken away. Whatever was left, mostly deserts, sagebrush deserts in the northern part of the West and hot deserts in the Southwest. Those were the Bureau of Land Management. And then also in Department of Interior is U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which manages the National Wildlife Refuges, but also is in charge for the Endangered Species Act and listing rare species and delisting rare species and recovering those species if they get on the list. And so that's under Interior. And then the Bureau of Indian Affairs also is in the U.S. Department of the Interior as well. And so they do, there's a whole branch of that department that's only dealing with tribal issues and dealing with tribal reservations. And that is its own long, sordid and corrupt story that, where that Bureau of Indian Affairs often sort of managed the tribes instead of letting the tribes manage themselves on their own lands that they kept for themselves. And as a result, there's a lot of what's called paternalism. And a lot of the Indian tribes, the indigenous tribes, they don't like the Bureau of Indian Affairs because they would rather have self-determination and have their tribal government be governing their reservation and not have some federal bureaucrat from D.C. telling them what to do.
Our whole history of manifest destiny is so frustrating, and it's actually a really dark past. And we still aren't doing right by the Native Americans.
Well, the manifest destiny, it doesn't just have to do with the Native Americans. It has to do with the lands and the wildlife too.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the whole thing is built on this idea of what's called dominionism, in which the book of Genesis in the Bible says the Lord, the God gave man dominion over the birds of the air and the beasts of the field, and we were in charge as if we were kings of these other species. And that gave rise to this whole idea of manifest destiny and the idea that we have to tame the wilderness, that we have to make it productive, and that wilderness is a waste of land and resources, and we have to tame that and make it profitable in order for that land to have real value. And that's where our Euro-American culture really went off the rails in terms of, our relationship with nature. We have a dysfunctional, abusive relationship with nature. And, over time, in the disciplines of ecology and wildlife biology, people like Aldo Leopold, people like E.O. Wilson started developing these concepts that all life is related and that we are just a small cog and we are not in charge. And We are just now catching up to the level of sophistication that the indigenous tribes had when we first arrived on this continent. And they already got it, right? I mean, if you talk to the Lakota from South Dakota, and they will tell you their word is Wolakota and Tanakwe Orison, both of me, which means everything is related. And they knew this.
Kin-centrism.
They had been here for 20 plus thousand years.
Yeah, it's the concept of kin-centrism. If you treat everything like it's your relative, you treat it with respect and honor.
That's our relationship with nature.
Yeah, it is. I remember going through a session in class last year, and we were talking about TEK, traditional ecological knowledge. So Native Americans take on stewardship of the land, and we've got like this fixation that the Western way is the best way. But if you utilize a concept called two-eyed seeing, and I'm sure you've heard of this, where you basically hybridize Western science with this TEK, this indigenous knowledge. If you hybridize that, you could really make some powerful impact in the world of conservation. But it's just getting outside of our bubble where we think that our way is the right and only way.
That's a really important concept. And to illustrate that, I was just last summer up in the Yukon and revising a scenic driving guide to Alaska and the Yukon that had been out of print for a number of years. And one of the stories from the central Yukon up north of the Ogilvie Mountains out in the tundra is a story of these, I think they were Quechin peoples, the legend of a brave fighting a giant beaver. Well, during the Pleistocene, there really were 6-foot tall beavers in the central Yukon, and there were humans in the central Yukon too. So that is probably a cultural memory that has been passed down from generation to generation over the course of 16,000 years. There is nothing that Western European and Euro-North American civilization has that stretches back 16,000 years into history. We can't remember that. But the traditional ecological knowledge of these tribes of the central Yukon, they have it because they've been passing these stories down from one generation to the next. And when that storyteller is telling the story, the elders are there in the audience to correct it if there's any deviation. And it's their own form of peer review. And it's a stronger form of history than our form of history. Because if you go back and you look at the historical journals of the early Spanish explorers or the early Euro-American explorers, they're full of all kinds of fanciful, exaggerations and misinterpretations and things that you laugh at. And frankly, the TEK information that I've seen so far from all the different tribes that we come in contact with and I've read about and heard from, their knowledge is real knowledge. And, you can go and into the scientific literature and say, yep, that lines up with this scientific study right over here that proved it. Many generations, many hundreds of years later, science finally arrived at the place where the indigenous people were in the first place.
When did we as a Western culture finally start utilizing prescribed burns? Because indigenous peoples have been doing that since time immemorial.
I think prescribed burns really started, gaining ground in the late 70s and early 1980s. And there are some ecosystems where, I'm living in one now in the Klamath-Siskiyou region of Southern Oregon and Northern California, where the tribes really did ignite thousands of small fires every year, everywhere they went. And that was a big part of that ecosystem. There were other ecosystems where you had old growth conifers that might not have burned for 500 or 600 or 800 years. And it really varied because the tribes had very different life ways and very different cultural traditions.
Mm-hmm. And one thing they really treasured in their culture was the coexistence with wolves. And Western Watersheds really focuses on wolf conservation. And there's a lot happening with the wolves right now on a national scale, but also here in Colorado. I don't know if you want to talk about both, but I would love to hear your take on what's happening with the wolves and why do you think it's happening?
Well, let's start with Colorado, and I've been involved in Western Watersheds Project has been involved with the wolf reintroduction effort from the very beginning, from before the ballot initiative.
A lot of
We were
criticism.
part of the part of the coalition that put that ballot initiative forward. We were part of watchdogging that through the process of developing a wolf plan, which has some problems, by the way, and through the introduction and trying to also we have had to go into court when the livestock industry and the extreme wing of the sporting groups decided to sue to try and stop the wolf reintroductions. And it's really a kind of an epic battle between the environmentalists and the conservationists and the people that want to restore a natural balance to the Rocky Mountains and hear the howl of the wolf once again echoing from the peaks the way it always did for tens of thousands of years. And those who fought to keep the wolf extinct because their grandfathers made the wolf extinct and killed them off and trapped them off and poisoned them off and shot them out. And these entrenched livestock interests and the extreme wing of the sporting community. And I'm a hunter myself, and I know not everybody is. And I know folks think that, that hunting, some folks think that hunting is unethical, and I can understand where that's coming from. But I'm a hunter, and I like to think that I follow ethical hunting standards and fair chase standards. And it really is disappointing to me, the extremists like the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, who's fighting Colorado wolf reintroduction and who's paying bounties of $2,000 and $1,000 in some cases in Idaho and Montana to get people to go out and kill wolves just to reduce the numbers. They're emotion-based, campaigns that they're trying to end wolves in North America, and the emotion is hate. These are hate groups, and they're trying to get rid of a part of nature that they don't want to see, because the nature that they want to see is only humans dominating the landscape and having every single antlered animal available to them so that it can be in front of their hunting scope, or not having any wolves taking the few numbers of livestock that occasionally wolves do take, if they're a livestock producer. And in Colorado, there have only been 34 confirmed wolf depredations on livestock in the last several years since wolves hit the ground. Only 34.
And it's largely sheep, right?
No, mostly cattle in this case.
Mostly cattle, okay.
But there was one lightning strike in North Park, Colorado, near Walden, that killed 50 cattle and one rancher, too, in one lightning strike. One lightning strike killed more cattle than all the wolf kills in the entire history of the Colorado wolf reintroduction. And yet the livestock industry screams bloody murder that wolves are going to be the end of the livestock industry, even though there are 2.6 million cattle in Colorado. I mean, it's a joke. But because they whine and cry and make these big sob stories, and they wear cowboy hats and big belt buckles, and they like to pretend like they represent the American West. They really don't. But they get a lot of attention by kicking and screaming and throwing a tantrum, and that's what they've been doing. And they've kind of been directing a lot of the politics in Colorado in a lot of ways, even though they lost the election.
Yeah, it's interesting that you said that it is an emotional tactic that is riling those folks up, because I guarantee you, if you went and spoke to someone who was against the wolves being reintroduced here in Colorado, and you asked them about the folks who were for it, they would say that they're the ones being emotionally drawn to this decision.
There are a lot of people who love wolves. There are a lot of people who love wildlife.
Yeah,
that's an emotion too. Love is an emotion. Hate is an emotion. I love wild places. That's an emotional response to nature, I suppose. I'm also a wildlife biologist, so I know the science inside and out. And the science is on the side of wolf recovery.
Another argument about the wolves here is that it's not the same species. We had historically two species, a plains and more of a mountain varietal, I believe. And they're arguing that these aren't the original species that were here. Isn't it a Canadian hybrid?
Well, there were many subspecies of wolf across the North American continent. And the important thing to remember here is that all of them blended into each other. And they evolved into these different subspecies, which is, they can interbreed. because in those particular environments, so in the desert Southwest, you had the Mexican wolf, a little smaller, a little tawnier, kind of better camouflage for those dun kind of landscapes of the desert Southwest where everything is kind of brown. Then in the northern forest, you had wolves that were better suited, larger, because they had to survive through the winter. Then out on the plains, you had other kinds of wolves. But all these wolves were kind of local varieties that nature had tailored to that landscape, basically out of the same genome, basically out of the same gene pool that was all one wolf species in North America. And even the Mexican wolf is not its own species. It's a subspecies of gray wolf. And so under natural conditions, all of those wolves would have kind of interbred all along these geographic lines. The Mexican wolves would have bred with the red wolves. The Mexican wolves would have bred with the plains wolves, and the wolves that we have in the Canadian West would have come all the way down and would have come down into Colorado on a regular basis, because males that are dispersing, trying to find their own territory, they can travel 1,000 miles. So the idea that you have these Canadian super wolves that never would have been here in Colorado, that's kind of a fantasy that that's you've been visiting too many dispensaries and imbibing in too much THC.
Yeah, and genetic mixing or hybridization is good, and it is healthy, and it keeps the gene pool healthy.
That's right. And not just that, but, as these Canadian, in some cases, Canadian wolves, in some cases, Oregonian wolves have been transplanted into Colorado, they're going to be sorted out by genetics too, and by natural selection. So the wolves that are best suited to live in Colorado are going to be the ones that survive and reproduce. And the ones that are least suited to the exact kinds of habitats and situations that we have in Colorado, they're going to get weeded out. And so you're going to, over the long span of time, end up with a wolf that is just like the wolf that was always here.
Yeah.
Because natural selection gave you that wolf in Colorado, because the habitat and the conditions in Colorado made that the ideal wolf to be here.
And I want to explain this for folks listening, that natural selection is not this evil, abrupt change in this twisted science of evolution. Natural selection is individuals and populations of species being most adapted or most fit to live in a certain type of area, a certain type of terrain, a certain type of climate. And so those individuals that are most fit to live in those areas are more likely to survive. So they continue to perpetuate their genes. And that's why you have these very specific types of species, and then you'll get subspecies in some areas based on basically based on fitness, based on those traits that allow them to survive and thrive in those areas.
Yeah, nature separates the wheat from the chaff every time.
I know. All right, everyone. Thank you for listening to today's part 1 of our conversation with Erik Molvar of the Western Watersheds Project. I hope that after listening to that first half of the chat, you have a deep found love and respect for this man, because he truly cares for conservation of our great outdoors. And you couldn't see his face during the episode, but he was smiling and glowing just about the entire time, even though we were talking about some pretty heavy subjects there. So thanks, Erik, for joining me on the chat. And thank you to the Fire Once Lost for letting us use Appalachian Trail for our intro and our outro music. We really love it, Anders. Thanks again. And we wouldn't be here without you, our listeners. So the biggest thanks goes to y'all. Thanks for listening to our podcast. And to wrap up, I just wanted to let you know that it doesn't matter if you're sneaking in a hike before or after your shift while working at a bar or as a server at a restaurant, or if you're doing a through hike like the CDT right now, or the Eastern Continental Trail, the ECT. Yeah, the Eastern Continental Trail. All these other trails, or if you're just doing a cute little hike around your neighborhood to get your dog some exercise. Because really, at the end of the day, we're just all outside walking. Just wanted to let you know that here at our show, Yeti Walks into Base Camp, we don't use AI for anything. AI has detrimental impacts on our environment, and we just don't want any part of it. So just know that when you're listening to our episodes, each one is hand edited by our team with talent and integrity. Thanks for listening.